Discover unforgettable stories that inspire. When a stranger yells at Barron Trump in a Philly cafe, what happens next changes everything. A furious clash turns into a raw, heartfelt connection as Barron listens to Marcus, a man broken by loss, revealing a forgotten letter from his son, Ethan. From one talk, a cafe transforms, a father reunites with his child, and the Listener Project sparks a citywide movement of empathy. Dive into this tale of understanding, redemption, and the power of small acts. Watch how a single moment rewrites lives. Thanks for watching. I'm pushing for my first 1,000 subs on Superior Stories. Please support me with a sub and a like.
The cafe sat tucked into a corner of Philadelphia's Old City, a stubborn little brick building that had weathered decades of storms and stories. On this breezy March afternoon in 2025, sunlight spilled through smudged windows, painting golden streaks across worn wooden tables. The air buzzed with the hiss of an espresso machine and the faint clatter of porcelain, mingling with the scent of cinnamon rolls and burnt sugar, a cozy shield against the chills sneaking through the cracked front door. It was the kind of place where locals lingered over steaming mugs, their voices a soft murmur beneath the hum of a radio crooning jazz. For a moment, it felt like time had paused, offering a sliver of peace in a world that rarely slowed down. Barron Trump slipped through that door just after 2 o'clock, his tall frame slightly stooped, as if he could shrink his 6'7" silhouette into something less conspicuous. He wore a plain gray hoodie and faded jeans, the hood pulled low over his sharp features, a dog-eared copy of the Count of Monte Cristo tucked under his arm. At 19, he was the youngest son of a former president, a name that trailed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. But here, in this cafe, he wasn't the tabloid caricature or the political punching bag. He was just a guy craving a quiet hour, a chance to sink into a story and let the world blur around him. He picked a table by the window, the one with a wobbly leg and a scratched surface, and settled in, flipping open his book. The chatter of strangers sipping lattes and scrolling phones felt like a rare gift, anonymity, or something close to it. Behind the counter, Lila Carter watched him settle in, her sharp hazel eyes flicking over the room with the vigilance of someone who'd built this place from scratch. Mid-40s, with dark curls pulled into a messy bun and a faded apron tied tight, she moved with purpose, wiping mugs, restocking sugar packets, keeping the rhythm of her cafe alive. Her hands bore the faint scars of years spent grinding to keep this haven afloat after her divorce left her with nothing but a lease and a dream. The cafe was her lifeline, a fragile bubble of warmth she'd carved out in a city that didn't always care. She noticed Barron, not because she recognized him at first, but because he didn't demand attention like the usual rush hour crowd. He was a quiet anomaly, and that was fine by her. As long as he paid for his tea, he could stay. Across the room, Marcus Reed pushed through the door, his wiry frame taut with a tension that didn't match the cafe's easy vibe. In his early 50s, he carried the weight of hard years in the lines of his weathered face, graying stubble framing a jaw clenched tight, eyes dark and restless beneath a frayed ball cap. His jacket, once navy, had faded to a dull gray, its cuffs threadbare from too many winters. His hands, calloused and scarred, flexed at his sides as he scanned the room, boots scuffing the hardwood floor. Marcus wasn't a regular here. He'd wandered in on a whim, drawn by the promise of cheap coffee after another morning of dead-end job hunting. A decade ago, he'd been a welder at a steel mill out in Chester, a steady man with a paycheck and a family. But when the mill shuttered, replaced by machines that didn't need brakes or benefits, his world unraveled. His wife left, his son drifted, and now he was just another ghost in a city that moved on without him. Barron didn't notice Marcus at first, lost in the pages where Edmond Dantes plotted his revenge. The cafe's warmth wrapped around him, a fleeting escape from the life he'd been born into, a whirlwind of flashing cameras, whispered rumors, and expectations he never asked for. He'd grown up dodging the glare of public scrutiny, his every move dissected by people who didn't know him. Even now, sipping lukewarm chamomile tea, he felt the faint itch of being watched, though no one here seemed to care. It was a freedom he chased in small doses, these stolen moments where he could just be. He turned a page, the paper crinkling under his fingers, and let himself sink deeper into the story. Lila, meanwhile, kept one eye on the counter and the other on her customers. She'd seen all kinds come through, students cramming for exams, retirees swapping gossip, the occasional drifter looking for a warm seat. Marcus caught her attention, though. Something about the way he hovered near the door, shoulders hunched like he was bracing for a fight. She'd learned to read people over the years, and he had the look of someone carrying more than he could hold. She brushed it off, turning to refill the coffee grinder, the sharp scent of roasted beans grounding her. This was her space, her rules. As long as he didn't start trouble, he could stay. Marcus's gaze landed on Barron, and something snapped. Maybe it was the casual ease of the kid sitting there, book in hand, untouched by the grind Marcus knew too well. Maybe it was the hoodie that looked new, the posture that screamed privilege even in its attempt to hide. Whatever it was, it lit a fuse Marcus had been nursing for years, a slow burn of resentment that flared hot and sudden. He took a step forward, boots thudding against the floor, his voice rising like a storm breaking loose. The cafe's fragile peace was about to shatter, and no one, not Barron, not Lila, not the strangers clutching their mugs, saw it coming. The cafe's warm hum shattered like glass under a hammer as Marcus Reed's voice erupted, raw and jagged, slicing through the air. You think you're better than us, don't you? His words weren't just loud. They were a weapon, aimed straight at Barron Trump, who sat frozen mid-page, his chamomile tea steaming faintly in its chipped mug. Every head in the room snapped toward the sound, eyes wide, breaths held. Lila Carter flinched behind the counter, her rag dropping from her hand as the piece she'd fought to preserve crumbled in an instant. Marcus stood a few feet from Barron's table, his wiry frame trembling, one calloused finger stabbing the air like he could pin the kid to the wall with it. Born with a golden spoon while the rest of us scrape by? Tell me I'm wrong. Barron's book slipped shut with a soft thud, his long fingers resting on the cover as he looked up, blue eyes meeting Marcus's dark, furious glare. For a heartbeat, he didn't move, not out of fear, but out of sheer shock. This wasn't the script he'd lived 100 times before. The paparazzi ambushes, the shouted questions, the glares from strangers who thought they knew him. This was different, personal, unscripted, a punch he hadn't braced for. The cafe went still, the jazz on the radio a faint whisper under the weight of Marcus's rage. A teen in a corner booth lowered her phone, her thumbs hovering over the screen. An older woman, Ellen, clutched her coffee cup like it could shield her from the storm brewing 5 feet away. Lila's hand twitched toward the phone under the counter, her mind racing. Call the cops? Wait it out. Marcus took a step closer, his boots scuffing the hardwood, his voice dropping to a growl that somehow felt louder than the shout. You'll never know what it's like to lose it all, will you? To wake up one day and find out the world don't need you anymore. His eyes burned with a fire stoked by years of wounds, lost jobs, broken promises, a life that slipped through his fingers like sand. He wasn't just seeing Barron. He was seeing every suit who'd signed the Mills death warrant, every politician who'd shrugged at his pleas, every kid who'd grown up soft while he grew hard. Look at you, he spat, sitting there with your fancy book, like you ain't got a care in the world. You ever worked a day in your life? Ever gone hungry? Inside Barron's head, a storm of his own churned. Walk away, a voice whispered, the one that had guided him through years of dodging spotlight traps. Slip out the door, let this guy yell himself hoarse, let the cafe forget him by tomorrow. It'd be easy, he'd done it before. But another voice, quieter but stubborn, pushed back. If I leave, he wins. They all win, the ones who think I'm just a name, not a person. He felt the familiar weight of being judged, the suffocating sense that no matter what he said or did, he'd always be the rich kid, the spoiled son, the target. He hated it. Hated how it boxed him in, how it erased the parts of him no one bothered to see. His jaw tightened, but his face stayed calm, a mask he'd perfected over years of scrutiny. Marcus wasn't done. He leaned in, close enough that Barron could smell the stale tobacco on his breath, the bitterness rolling off him in waves. You think you're untouchable, don't you? Up in your towers, laughing at guys like me. I had a life once, good job, a family. Then it was gone, and nobody cared. Nobody. His voice cracked, just for a second, and something flickered in his eyes. Pain, not just anger. He straightened up, fists balled at his sides, daring Barron to argue, to prove him right. The room held its breath, a collective heartbeat pounding in the silence. Lila's fingers brushed the phone, her lips parting as if to call out. But she stopped. Something in Barron's stillness held her back. Barron's mind raced, the internal tug-of-war clawing at him. He's wrong about me, but he's not wrong about everything. He'd never gone hungry, never watched a paycheck vanish overnight. His life was cushioned, sure, private schools, security details, a name that opened doors. But he knew loss in his own way. The loss of normalcy, of friendships untainted by his last name, of a childhood spent under a microscope. He'd felt invisible too, not in Marcus's way, but in the way people saw a symbol instead of a soul. Say something, he told himself, or he'll keep screaming, and this'll be all they remember. His heart thudded, but his voice, when it came, was steady, low, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. I don't think I'm better than you, sir. What's got you so mad? The question hung there, simple but loaded, and Marcus blinked, thrown off balance. He'd expected a fight, a dismissal, anything but this, a kid half his age looking him in the eye, asking instead of telling. What's got me mad? He echoed, voice rising again. You really want to know? Or is this some game to you, some rich boy stunt to look good? He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that made Ellen flinch. You couldn't handle my life, kid. You wouldn't last a day. His fists unclenched, then clenched again, like he was fighting something bigger than Barron, fighting himself. Inside Marcus, the rage wasn't alone. It wrestled with a gnawing ache he'd buried deep, a voice he barely let himself hear. Why isn't he yelling back? Why is he just sitting there? He'd come in here to unload, to make someone feel the weight he carried every day. Barron was the perfect target, young, polished, everything Marcus wasn't. But that calm stare, that quiet question, it poked a hole in his armor, and he hated it. He's mocking me, he thought, but the idea didn't stick. He'd seen mockery before. This wasn't it. His chest heaved, memories crashing in. The mill's last day, the silence of an empty house, the way his son's footsteps faded out the door. He wanted Barron to snap, to give him a reason to keep swinging. But Barron didn't. Lila watched, her breath shallow, the cafe's fate teetering in her hands. She'd seen fights before, drunks, exes, once a guy who didn't like his latte, but this was different. This was a collision of worlds, and it could break her little haven apart. She glanced at the teen, now filming with her phone, and at Ellen, whose knuckles were white around her mug. If this goes south, I'm done, she thought. The rent was late, the margins thin, one bad day could tip her over. But Barron's voice, steady as stone, pulled her focus back. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. And that alone kept her from dialing 911. Marcus stepped closer still, his shadow falling over Barron's table, his voice a low snarl now. You got an answer, kid? Or you just gonna sit there pretending you care? The accusation was a test, a last shove to see if Barron would crack. The cafe felt smaller, the walls pressing in as every eye locked on the two of them. Barron's book lay forgotten, his tea gone cold, and the air thrummed with a question no one dared ask aloud. What happens now? Marcus's rage was a live wire, sparking and wild, but Barron's silence, his refusal to bite back, was its own kind of power, and it was about to shift everything. Marcus Reed loomed over Barron Trump's table, his shadow swallowing the faint sunlight spilling across the scratched wood. His voice, a low snarl, lashed out like a whip. You got an answer, kid? Or you just gonna sit there pretending you care? The cafe held its breath, the air thick with the weight of his challenge. Lila Carter's fingers hovered near the phone, her hazel eyes darting between the two men, while the teen in the corner booth angled her phone higher, the red recording light a silent witness. Ellen's coffee trembled in her hands, the porcelain clinking faintly against the saucer. Everyone waited for Barron to crack, to snap back, to storm out, to give Marcus the fight he was begging for. But Barron didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the wobbly leg creaking under his weight, and met Marcus's glare with a steady, unblinking gaze. His hand slid off the Count of Monte Cristo, resting lightly on the table, palms up, an open gesture, not a clenched fist. Then, in a voice so calm it felt like a lifeline tossed into a hurricane, he said, "Sit down, sir. I don't know your story, but I'd like to. He nudged the empty chair across from him with his foot, the scrape of wood against hardwood slicing through the silence. It wasn't a command or a plea. It was an invitation, raw and real, and it hit the room like a thunderbolt no one saw coming. Marcus froze, his fists unclenching for a split second as if the words had knocked the wind out of him. "Sit," he barked, a harsh laugh ripping from his throat. "What? You think I'm here to chat over coffee like we're buddies?" His eyes narrowed, searching Barron's face for a trick, a smirk, anything to justify the rage still boiling in his chest. But Barron didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He just sat there, shoulders relaxed, waiting, like he had all the time in the world for a man who'd come in ready to tear him apart. The unexpectedness of it, the sheer audacity, threw Marcus off his axis, and for a moment, he didn't know what to do. Lila's breath caught, her hand dropping from the phone. She'd braced for chaos, shouts, maybe fists, a call to the cops that'd tank her Yelp reviews. But this was something else. The teen's phone trembled slightly, her whispered, "Oh my God," barely audible as she zoomed in. Ellen set her cup down, leaning forward, her gray curls brushing the table. The cafe, still as a held breath, teetered on the edge of something no one could name yet. Marcus glared down at Barron, his jaw tight, his mind a tangle of fury and confusion. "He's mocking me," he thought again, but the idea crumbled under that steady blue stare. Finally, with a grunt that sounded more like surrender than agreement, he grabbed the chair, yanked it back, and dropped into it, his faded jacket rustling as he crossed his arms. "Fine," he muttered, voice rough as gravel. "You want to hear it? Buckle up." Barron nodded, leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, a signal he was all in. Marcus took a deep breath, his chest heaving as if he were dragging the words up from a well he'd sealed shut years ago. "You look at me and see a nobody, right? Some washed-up guy yelling in a cafe. But I wasn't always this." His voice cracked, just a hair, and he glanced around, daring anyone to interrupt. No one did. 10 years ago, I was a welder, damn good one too. Steel mill out in Chester. Worked there 20 years, built a life. House, wife, a boy who thought I hung the moon. Then one day, they call us in, say the machines can do it cheaper. No warning, no, thanks for your time. Just a pink slip and a pat on the back. The cafe stayed silent, the espresso machine's hiss a distant echo as Marcus's words sank in. Lila's sharp eyes softened, her fingers tracing the edge of a mug she'd stopped wiping. She knew that story. Too many regulars had carried it through her door. The teen's phone dipped slightly, her face paling as she listened. Ellen nodded, a quiet slipping out, like she'd tasted that kind of loss herself. Marcus kept going, his gaze locked on Barron now, his voice steadying even as it grew heavier. "I tried to bounce back. Odd jobs, construction, whatever I could scrape. But it's not enough when the bills pile up. My wife, she couldn't take it. Said I wasn't the man she married anymore. Took our son and left. He was 12 then. Haven't seen him since he was 15. Barron's face didn't change, but his eyes flickered. Something deep, something human. Marcus didn't notice. He was too far in now, the dam broken, the words spilling out like they'd been clawing to escape. You know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like nothing? Like everyone's already written you off? That's me every damn day. And then I see you, sitting here, all clean and calm, reading like the world's your playground. It burns, kid. Burns so bad I can't see straight." He paused, rubbing a hand over his stubble, his breath ragged. "So yeah, I'm mad. Mad at you. Mad at everything. What you got to say to that?" The question hung there, sharp and heavy, and the cafe seemed to lean in, every soul waiting for Barron's move. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it sit, let Marcus's pain breathe. Then, slowly, he leaned closer, his voice soft but firm, carrying a weight that silenced the room. "I've never lost like that. Never had to fight for a roof or a meal. You're right, I can't know that. But I do know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like people see someone else. Someone they've already judged before I open my mouth. Maybe that's not the same, but it's real." He paused, his eyes locked on Marcus's. "I'm not here to fix you. I just want to understand." Marcus blinked, his tough shell cracking just enough for something to slip through. Shock, maybe, or the faintest flicker of recognition. He hadn't expected that. Not the honesty, not the lack of pity. "Understand?" he muttered, almost to himself, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. He didn't know what to do with it. This kid staring back at him, not as an enemy, but as a mirror. The cafe exhaled, the tension shifting, not gone, but different. Lila's shoulders eased, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Ellen whispered, "Well, I'll be," to no one in particular. The teen tapped her phone, murmuring, "This is insane," as the video rolled on. And then it spread. The teen, her name was Mia, though no one knew it yet, hit upload before Marcus even finished talking. "Barron Trump just turned a fight into something unreal," she typed, her shaky footage hitting X with a ping that echoed beyond the cafe's brick walls. Within minutes, likes ticked up, 10, 50, 100. Comments poured in. "Is this for real? No way he's that chill. Who's the guy?" By the time Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at Barron like he was seeing him for the first time, the video had legs, racing across phones, sparking debates, drawing eyes. A guy at a table near the door nudged his friend, showing the screen. "Look at this, happening right here." Lila noticed the shift, customers glancing at their phones, then at Barron, whispers rippling like a tide. She stepped out from behind the counter, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. Mia's video caught Barron's line, "I just want to understand," and it hit like a match to dry grass. Views climbed past 1,000, then 2. A local news intern saw it, flagged it, and pitched it to her editor. "Kid's got a point. Could be a story." Back in the cafe, Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, his voice quieter now. "You're not what I thought," he said, almost reluctant, like the words cost him something. Barron gave a small nod, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "Neither are you." The room buzzed with a new energy. Not peace, not yet, but a crack in the wall that had divided it. Mia's video kept rolling, the numbers climbing, and outside those smudged windows, the world started to listen. The cafe hummed with a fragile, electric tension as Marcus Reed sat across from Barron Trump, his arms still crossed, but his fire dimming, replaced by a weary kind of quiet. The scratch table between them held his confession like a weight. Years of loss, a life unraveled, a son gone silent. Barron's steady gaze hadn't wavered, his chamomile tea long cold, the dog-eared Count of Monte Cristo pushed aside. Around them, the room teetered on a knife's edge. Lila Carter stood frozen near the counter, her apron twisted in her hands. Mia's phone trembled as she filmed, the view count ticking past 5,000. Ellen leaned forward, her gray curls brushing the table, eyes glistening. The air felt thick, heavy with the aftermath of Marcus's story and Barron's simple vow. "I just want to understand." But what came next wasn't just understanding. It was a collision of past and present that no one, not even Barron, saw coming. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw as if trying to shake off the vulnerability he'd let slip. His voice, rough but softer now, cut through the silence. "You know, I didn't come in here to spill my guts. Just wanted to yell, let it out on someone who'd feel it." He glanced at Barron, his dark eyes narrowing slightly, testing the kid's resolve one last time. "But you're sitting there like I'm not some crazy guy off the street. What?" The question wasn't angry anymore. It was raw, almost pleading, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. He didn't expect an answer that would matter. He'd stopped expecting much from anyone years ago. Barron leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low but steady, carrying a weight that silenced the faint jazz still whispering from the radio. "Because you're not just some guy. You've got a story, and it's real. I've spent my whole life with people talking at me, about me, without ever asking who I am. I'm tired of it. So when you walked in, yeah, you were mad, but you were saying something. I figured I'd listen." He paused, his blue eyes locking onto Marcus's, unflinching. Maybe that's all anyone needs sometimes, someone to hear them. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling out across the cafe. Lila's breath hitched, her sharp edges softening as she watched Barron, really watched him, for the first time. Mia's phone dipped, her lips parting in a silent, "Wow," the red light still blinking. Ellen dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, murmuring, "Lord have mercy," under her breath. Marcus blinked, his tough shell splintering, and for a moment, he didn't know where to look. Down at the table, out the window, anywhere, but at this kid who just turned his rage into something he couldn't name. He rubbed the back of his neck, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're a weird one, you know that?" Barron's lips twitched, a flicker of a smile, genuine and unguarded. But before he could respond, Marcus's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood absently. "There's something else," he said, his tone shifting, like he was unearthing a memory he'd buried deep. "My boy, Ethan, he used to talk about you. Back when he was little, maybe 9 or 10. Saw you on TV once, some event with your dad. Wrote you a letter, said he wanted to be tall like you someday." He chuckled, a dry, broken sound. "Stupid kid stuff. Mailed it off to some White House address. Never got a reply, of course. Figured it got lost, or tossed. But he was proud of it. Kept a copy in his room till he left with his mom." The cafe went still, the weight of that confession sinking in. Barron's face changed, his calm mask cracked, just for a second, replaced by a flash of something raw and unguarded. "A letter," he said, voice barely audible, leaning closer. "To me?" His mind raced back. 2016, 2017, those blurry years of Secret Service escorts and mail he never saw, filtered through layers of staff and security. He'd been a kid himself then, 10 or 11, oblivious to the letters that piled up in some office, most never reaching him. "I didn't know," he said, louder now, his eyes searching Marcus's. "I never saw it. If I had, I'd have written back, I swear." Marcus looked up sharply, his brow furrowing, disbelief warring with something softer. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice thick with doubt but tinged with a flicker of hope. "You're telling me you didn't just ignore it?" Barron shook his head, urgent now, his hands pressing flat against the table. "No, I didn't get it. Nobody told me. I wasn't the one tossing stuff out. But I can find it. I've got people who can dig through that old mail. If it's there, I'll get it to you. To Ethan." His words came fast, a promise spilling out before he could second-guess it, driven by a need to prove he wasn't the ghost Marcus thought he was. The room seemed to shrink, every eye locked on the two of them. Lila stepped closer, abandoning the counter entirely, her arms falling to her sides. "You're going to track down a kid's letter from 10 years ago?" she asked, half skeptical, half awed. Barron nodded, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I am." Mia's phone caught it all, the view count spiking past 10,000 as comments flooded in. "This is wild. He's for real. Find that letter." Ellen clasped her hands, whispering, "Bless him," like a prayer. But it was Marcus who held the moment, his tough exterior crumbling as he stared at Barron, his voice breaking. "You do that? For some kid you don't even know?" Barron didn't hesitate. "For your kid. Because he mattered to you, and you're here telling me about him. That's enough." The words hit Marcus like a punch he didn't dodge, his eyes glistening as he looked away, blinking hard. "Ethan, he'd lose his mind if he knew," he muttered, almost to himself. Then, slowly, he reached across the table, his rough hand outstretched, a gesture so sudden it startled even him. Barron met it without a second's pause, clasping it firmly, the handshake a bridge between two worlds that shouldn't have crossed. The cafe fell silent, the weight of that grip louder than any shout. Lila's voice broke the hush, soft but clear. "I'll be damned," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she shook her head. Ellen wiped a tear, her napkin crumpled in her fist. Mia whispered, "This is it," to her phone, the footage trembling as she fought to hold steady. Marcus pulled back, smoothing his jacket awkwardly, his voice thick. "I came in here thinking you were everything I hated. But you're something else, kid." Barron's smile was small but real, lighting his face in a way that made him look younger, unguarded. "I'm just me," he said simply. "And I meant it. I'll find that letter." The moment hung there, heavy and bright, a pivot no one could have scripted. Marcus's hand lingered in the air for a second before dropping, his shoulders slumping, not in defeat, but in release. Barron leaned back, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for years. And in that exchange, something clicked, not just for them, but for everyone watching. Barron realized it then, the deeper truth cutting through the noise. Listening wasn't just kindness, it was a lifeline, a way to pull someone back from the edge. Marcus felt it too, a shred of dignity reclaimed, a flicker of faith in a world he'd given up on. The cafe didn't erupt, didn't cheer, it just felt it, a shared heartbeat pulsing through the room. Outside, Mia's video raced past 20,000 views. The hashtag Café Connection trending as strangers online typed, "Who's Ethan?" Barron's gotta find that letter. Inside, the two men sat in a silence that wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with something new. Marcus looked at Barron, really looked at him. Not a symbol, not a punching bag, but a kid who'd seen him when no one else had. And Barron saw Marcus. Not a ghost, not a failure, but a father who'd fought to be remembered. It was the peak of their collision, a moment so human it hurt, and it changed everything. The cafe exhaled as Marcus Reed and Barron Trump released their handshake, the tension that had gripped the room dissolving into something softer, something alive. Marcus sat back, his weathered hands resting on the table, no longer clenched but still, like he was holding on to a moment he hadn't expected to find. Barron picked up his cold tea, took a sip, and set it down with a faint smile. A quiet return to normalcy that felt anything but ordinary. Around them, the air buzzed with a new energy. Lila Carter leaned against the counter, her sharp edges smoothed by a grin she couldn't hide. Mia's phone steadied as her video soared past 50,000 views, comments flooding in. Ellen folded her napkin, her eyes bright with a hope she hadn't carried in years. What had started as a clash had turned into a bridge, and the story wasn't done. It was just beginning to spread. 3 days later, Barron made good on his promise. Back in his New York apartment, he dug through contacts, old staffers, family aides, anyone who might have handled the avalanche of mail that poured into the White House a decade ago. Look for a letter from an Ethan Reed, he told them, voice firm. Probably 2016 or 17. Kid stuff, handwritten. It took hours, then days, sifting through dusty boxes in a DC storage room. But they found it. A creased envelope, the address scrawled in a child's shaky cursive, postmarked from Philly. Inside was a single page. "Dear Barron, I saw you on TV. You're tall and cool. I want to be like you when I grow up. From Ethan." Barron held it, the paper worn but intact, and felt a pang he couldn't name. Not guilt, not pride, but something closer to purpose. He photocopied it, wrote a note. "Ethan, your dad's a fighter. Sorry I missed this back then. Barron," and mailed it to the cafe with a second copy for Marcus. When Lila handed Marcus the envelope a week later, his hands shook as he tore it open. He read Ethan's words first, his breath catching at the memory of his boy hunched over the kitchen table, pencil in hand. Then Barron's note, simple and straight, like the kid himself. Marcus's eyes glistened, his voice rough as he muttered, "Damn fool actually did it." He looked up at Lila, who'd started calling him a regular since he'd come back the day after their clash, quieter now, sipping black coffee instead of storming in. He didn't have to, Marcus said, folding the letter into his jacket pocket. But he did. That afternoon, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Ethan's, tracked down through an old friend. "Hey, kid," he said when a tentative voice answered. "Got something for you. Your letter, it made it." Ethan, 19 now and working construction in Jersey, went silent, then laughed, shaky but real. "Dad? No way." Their reunion came a week later, outside Lila's cafe. Ethan rolled up in a beat-up pickup, taller than Marcus remembered, his sandy hair cropped short under a hard hat. Marcus met him at the door, the letter clutched in one hand, and for a moment, they just stood there, two men unsure how to close a gap years wide. Then Ethan stepped forward, pulling his dad into a rough hug, his voice muffled. "Missed you, old man." Marcus clapped his back, eyes wet but grinning. "Missed you more." Barron wasn't there. He didn't need to be, but Lila snapped a photo through the window, texting it to him with a quick, "You did this." Barron, back in New York, smiled at his phone, the weight of that day in the cafe lifting just a little more. Marcus didn't vanish after that. He started showing up at the cafe daily, not just for coffee, but to help. Fixing a leaky sink, hauling bags of flour, even sweeping the floor when Lila's back ached. "Least I can do," he'd say, brushing off her thanks. She didn't argue. Business was picking up, the viral video drawing curious locals and out-of-towners alike. Mia's footage, now at 200,000 views, had turned the cafe into a quiet legend, the place where Barron Trump listened. Customers lingered longer, their chatter warmer, and Lila hired Marcus part-time, then full-time, slipping him a key one morning. "You're stuck with me now," she said, smirking. He nodded, a rare smile breaking through. Could be worse. The ripple spread beyond those brick walls. Mia, emboldened by her video's reach, started the Listener Project on X, a hashtag and a challenge. Sit with a stranger, hear their story, share it. Posts trickled in. A barista in Pittsburgh swapping tales with a trucker. A teacher in Miami learning her student's mom was a refugee. A retiree in Boise buying coffee for a homeless vet who just wanted to talk. The hashtag trended for a week, then stuck, spawning meetups in cafes citywide. Philly caught the fever hardest. Lila's Place became a hub, tables packed with people trading stories instead of scrolling phones. A local news crew showed up, their headline bold. One talk changed a city. They interviewed Marcus, who shrugged on camera. Kid listened. That's all it took. The cafe itself transformed. Lila painted the walls a bright ochre, hung photos of regulars. Marcus and Ethan grinning outside, Ellen with her coffee, Mia mid-laugh. She added a chalkboard sign by the door. Tell your story here. Customers did, scribbling notes, pinning them up. Lost my job, found a friend. Heard my neighbor out, best fight we never had. The register rang more often, the rent got paid, and Lila started smiling like she meant it. Never thought a shouting match would save me, she told a reporter, nodding toward Marcus as he wiped down tables. But here we are. Barron saw it unfold from afar, snippets on his phone between classes and chaos. The photo of Marcus and Ethan hit him hardest. He saved it, a quiet reminder of what he'd sparked. He didn't need the spotlight. He'd never wanted it. But knowing Ethan had his dad back, that Marcus had a job, that Lila's cafe thrived, it settled something in him. He'd walked into that cafe craving anonymity, but he'd left with a mark he hadn't planned to make. One night, scrolling X, he saw a Listener Project post, a Philly cop sharing coffee with a kid he'd once arrested, both laughing. Barron liked it, then shut his phone off, staring out his window. Small moves, he thought. Big waves. Philly felt it too. Strangers held doors, shared smiles, bought rounds of coffee for tables they didn't know. A bodega owner started a story hour on Sundays. A library hosted listener nights. The city didn't fix itself overnight. Potholes stayed, rents climbed, but it softened, just enough to notice. A week after the news piece, Ethan drove back to the cafe, bringing Marcus a thermos he'd welded himself, steel, like the old days. For your coffee, he said, grinning. Marcus took it, his calloused hand brushing the smooth metal, and nodded. You're a good kid. Ethan smirked. Learned from you. By the time Barron slipped back into Philly a month later, the cafe was packed. He didn't announce it, just walked in, hoodie up, and ordered tea. Lila spotted him, slid a mug over with a wink. On the house, troublemaker. Marcus, wiping down the counter, gave him a nod, gruff, but warm. Found my boy cause of you, he said, tapping his pocket where the letter stayed. Barron shrugged, sipping his tea. You found him cause you called. They didn't say more, didn't need to. Around them, the cafe thrummed with life. Stories swapped, laughs shared, a community stitched together by one raw, real day. The ripple kept moving. Online, in Philly, in quiet corners no one tracked. Mia's project hit 1 million tags. A national outlet picked up the story, from clash to connection. Barron didn't watch it. He didn't need to. He'd lived it, and that was enough. What happened in that Philly cafe wasn't just a moment. It was a mirror. Marcus Reed walked in ready to fight, a man broken by a world that forgot him. Barron Trump sat there, a kid judged before he could speak. In a room screaming to be right, they chose to listen, and that choice turned anger into understanding, loss into connection, a clash into a lifeline. It rebuilt a father and son, revived a cafe, and lit a fire that spread from a single table to a city, then beyond. One raw, real talk proved it. We're not as divided as we think when we stop shouting and start hearing. This isn't just their story, it's ours. Every day, we pass strangers carrying weights we can't see, grief, dreams, battles they've fought alone. Marcus was one of them, so was Barron, in his own way. They reminded us that behind every face is a story waiting to break through, if we're brave enough to ask. So here's the challenge. What's your cafe moment? Who's sitting across from you right now, on a bus, in a line, at your table, waiting for someone to say, I'm listening? You don't need a viral video or a famous name. You just need a minute, a question, a spark. One small move can ripple further than you'll ever know. Take it today. Sit with someone unexpected, a coworker you barely know, a neighbor you've never asked about, that guy on the corner with a cardboard sign. Hear them out, not to fix them, but to see them. Then come back here, drop it in the comments. Your story, your ripple. Let's make Superior Stories a chain reaction of good, one voice at a time. Because if a kid in a hoodie and a man with nothing left can change a city, imagine what we could do together. 1 million tags on the Listener Project started with one talk. Why not yours? This is what we're about here at Superior Stories. Finding the extraordinary in the everyday, the power in the quiet moments that shift everything. If this hit you, if you believe small acts can rewrite the world, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. We've got more tales like this, real, raw, and ready to inspire, so stick around. Marcus and Barron didn't just change a cafe, they showed us we can change each other. Now it's your turn. Go out there, listen, and light a spark. The world's waiting.